Thank you very much also for this invitation to talk here today. The talks over the past days have convincingly shown how much there is to be renegotiated, rephrased, and revisited within the discourse about and around modernity and modern art. With my paper, I would like to now draw your attention not to specific artworks or artists or stylistic categories, but to non-artist protagonists, and that for the very specific example, post-war West Germany. West German art did not progress linearly, nor did it develop simply through free and independent artists, as you can imagine. Instead, it was used and instrumentalized for profound political and cultural diplomatic interests when being presented abroad. This was a case in particular in the United States, undeniably the most powerful Western ally in the political sphere for West Germany, one of the most important markets for 20th century art, and without doubt the place where the most influential museum art institutions for that post-war decade were located. The exhibiting and presenting of German art after 1945 underwent a very particular shift of focus and content from a support of post-war art to the revisiting and rehabilitation of pre-war modernism. Before post-World War II art could gain international acceptance and build up a reputation, powerful forces deliberately slowed down and delayed this process, and gave prominent room and attention and support to pre-war styles instead, such as internationally known movements Die Brücke, Der Blaue Reiter, and Bauhaus. Why? Because the official interest was to first present the young democratic state of Western Germany as a safe haven for free and individual art, as well as having a strong will and inclination to do justice to those who had been defamed as degenerate under NS dictatorship, and only then to begin to experiment, and I'm quoting here from Konrad Adenauer's famous election campaign motto, by supporting younger post-war art. Interestingly, this attempt was not made or forced by the Western occupational powers of post-war Germany, but rather by influential West German curators and art historians who, for the most part, had been in office before 1945. I shall illustrate this strategy with the example of the exhibition German Art of the 20th Century, and a major exhibition of art that opened on October 1st, 1957 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the developments preceding it. And here we see Gerhard Mark's sculpture Maya, the one he rescued from his studio in 1943, and which was now perceived as rescued from the bombed out city and studio as an entrance to what was rescued of German 20th century art in general, a highly symbolic gesture. With over 170 paintings, graphic works, and sculptures, German Art of the 20th Century was the first major exhibition of German art in North America after the Second World War. Heralded in the accompanying press statements as, I quote, the most comprehensive survey of German 20th century art, end of quote, it suggested a balanced, all-encompassing representation of all stylistic movements of German art since 1900. Yet the show was far from being that. Instead of showing pre-war and post-war art equally, or even all facets of artistic production since 1900, a strong focus was set on pre-war modernism, namely German expressionism, while leaving out stylistic developments such as Dadaism or the very blunt and aggressive social criticism of new objectivity. Reasoning for this was given by the fact that expressionism was a national German style despite all international influences and links. Unlike what recent scholars have argued, this decision was not made by MoMA curators. Rather, it was the result of long and intense negotiations between the American Museum representatives and a group of German advisors, namely Kurt Martin, Alfred Hensen, and Werner Haftmann. And I ask for your apology to not have a better picture of Alfred Hensen. When I tried to rip one off, to rip one off the internet, I only found one with a watermark, so I decided to go for this one. While Andrew Cardiff Ritchie, then curator at MoMA, favored a show of 70 paintings, sculptures, and prints of both pre-war and post-war German art, The German side clearly preferred a stronger focus on pre-war modernism, in particular German expressionism. I quote, "If such an exhibition is being organized, it should be done by Germans, or at least in equal and significant parts with German participation. After all, we want to present ourselves with what we think," and I emphasize here what is underlined in the letter, "what we think is right and not with what Mr. Ritchie thinks is right and accurate." And accurate. Kurt Martin wrote with strong self-confidence to the German embassy in Washington, D.C. in December 1953. Despite this blunt statement, the German side would not dare risk the project, of course. And I quote again, "The event has an extraordinary meaning because the Museum of Modern Art is not only the platform for the entire United States, but also because together with a catalog, the exhibition will profoundly increase the prestige of German art of the 20th century and the entire Anglo-Saxon world." A report to the Foreign Service Department from April 1954 stated, "In order to get what the Germans had in mind, the West German government agreed to take on a significant share of all expenses, a fairly unusual amount of money, while MoMA paid for shipping and transportation within the US for US loans. The German government paid for all of the loans from Germany, insurance as well as for the entire catalog production. In return," and it gets even better, "in return, Ritchie signed off on all changes to the exhibition concept and the accompanying book. He was meant originally to write the catalog, but at the end, none of the articles were written by him, as originally planned, but by Werner Haftmann, Alfred Hensen, and a smaller section by William Lieberman, curator for prints and drawings at MoMA, who wrote in his catalog that his section of the exhibition is an addendum to the actual main part." The strong influence of Martin, Hensen, and Haftmann becomes even more important for the meaning and impact of the New York show when comparing it to one that has defined the perception of West German 20th century art to this very day, the first Documenta in Kassel in 1955. Just like in New York, the 1955 show in Kassel changed its original layout from a stronger inclusion of post-war art to a survey of European pre-war modernism under the influence of the very same protagonists, Kurt Martin, Alfred Hensen, and Werner Haftmann. The planning for the show in Kassel began in 1953, and I like to remind you that Martin's letter was from the same year. Only those artists who were already known and established were meant to be shown. I quote, "This is not an experiment or discovery, but a documentation of what has been achieved today already." Read an expose for the show, meant to be sent to potential lenders. The decision to abandon the concept of a, quote, "competitive exhibition," end of quote, of contemporary art was made because of the attempt to rehabilitate formerly defamed art and to introduce it to a wider audience after 12 years of censorship. At the same time, German modernism was supposed to be shown next to European art of the same period, thus alternating the fame and achievements of pre-war modernism and re-entering it into the international discourse on modern art styles and movements, intentions which clearly paralleled those for the New York show. The similarities between the first Documenta and the MoMA exhibition of 1957 can even be found in the selection and placement of a number of artworks within the installation. In New York, one artwork placed at the entrance of the show made a particularly obvious reference to the predecessor in Kassel. Opposite to the entrance door, where you saw the sculpture, visitors encountered Ernst Ludwig Kirchner's famous painting, and here you can see it on the side. This is a Documenta. The reproduction was shown. In addition to Kirchner's painting, and here I cut it short, there were a number of other paintings, Otto Dix, the artist's parents, from the collection of the Landesgalerie in Hanover, Bernhard Heiliger's head of Ernst Reuter, which you can see here, the very first sculpture, Paula Modersohn-Becker's self-portrait with a camellia, Oskar Kokoschka's portrait of Dr. Tietze and wife, and Wilhelm Lehmbruck's Kneeling Woman, here, which was known to the American audience already from the first Armory show in 1913, and those who managed to go to Kassel, of course, as well. If the very same works were not available as loans for the states, the curators often picked similar works in the cases of Wassily Kandinsky, Otto Müller, Theodor Werner, Willy Baumeister, and Hans Ullmann, which, by the way, are the very few representatives of post-war art, for the most part, except of Kandinsky and Müller, of course. There were various reasons for presenting primarily pre-war modernism in the US show. For the German side, it offered the possibility to rehabilitate, as I mentioned. For the Americans, it was clear that the local audience would react better to pre-war modernism than to post-war art. This attitude and reaction had been tested previously. Since 1951, a number of efforts had been made by the American Federation of Arts, the AFA, to present exhibitions of post-war German art in the United States with little success. Founded in 1906, the association was organizing exhibitions to travel the United States and began broadening their activities in 1950 to also include international shows. In 1950, members of the American Allied Forces stationed in Berlin proposed a project called Contemporary Berlin Artists, there we go, to the AFA, which came as a first show to tour the country. It was contemporary art, but the Museum Cleveland took the opportunity to place 3 of their sculptures within the exhibition, Barlach and Dina Kuhn, which is an Austrian artist from the Wiener Werkstätten. So absolutely no link to the exhibition, but nice examples of their own collection. The AFA continued their program with a number of German shows, German drawing in watercolors, and post-war German theater design in 52, 53, post-war German color prints in 53, recent architecture in West Germany in 53, 54, Nuremberg and the German world in 54, 55, and from 55 to 58, a mid-century review German expressionist works collected by Richard Feigen. A mid-century review and German expressionist works collected by Richard Feigen. I could go on and on. They had a whole series. But interesting is the change of strategy for the AFA again. Already in 1953, the year they started planning the MoMA show, the AFA directors had realized that neither museums nor the audience in the US reacted positively to the efforts of promoting post-war art. For an exhibition of 20th century art planned for 1955, the AFA made clear to their German counterparts that, I quote, a particular value had to be set on the fact that big names of German expressionism need to be presented, for example, Nolde, Pechstein, Klee, Kokoschka, etc., because otherwise no museum would be interested in the exhibition. The German embassy reported immediately to the Foreign Office and planned accordingly. Obviously, this change of strategy was successful, since in autumn of 1955, a mid-century review opened in Louisville, Kentucky, against all odds and doubts from German lenders. The main lender, by the way, to the show was Hildebrand Gorlit, whom some of you, or most of you, may know from recent press reports, about his son mainly. Responses to post-war art, even when being put in the context of pre-war predecessors as being attempted now, left US critics skeptical and sometimes even openly condescending, despite all efforts from the AFA and the German counterparts. A critic from the Harvard Crimson bluntly stated about the 1955 show, quote, a mid-century review provides an excellent background. The period of 1905 to 1935 was one of great fluorescence in German art. It saw the formation of 3 extremely influential bands of artists: Die Brücke, creators of a monumental expressionist style; Der Blaue Reiter, who made bold experiments in color and form, one of whose members painted the first abstract pictures; and finally, the Bauhaus painter, who found a creative center for their work in a design institute that had attempted to unite the arts under the leadership of architecture. Or more blatant contrast could hardly be conceived than between German art between then and 35 to 55. They're examples of the photographic realism that was the order of the day during the Nazi regime, so that this era appears as a large blank. But its dryness and the way of artistic ideas is shown by what came after. Contemporary German art seems to be well behind literature in recovering from the war. There's almost no evidence of originality that influenced the whole Western art in the early part of the century. What we see are derivative paintings. The influence of the American abstract expressionist school is clear in the work of Fritz Winter. Willy Baumeister is a second-rate Miro, and others like Hans Ullmann and Ernst Wilhelm Ney are bound in vision of Picasso. Were it not for the fact that many of theorists of German art, like Albers, who is in Yale, are now cut off from their traditional sources, Germany might now be once again making important contributions to the fine art. End of quote. While it is easy to argue against such harsh judgments of post-war art and their role of models, to reduce Winter to the impact of American abstract expressionism is a little harsh. This review reflects, nevertheless, a common and persistent opinion about German post-war art. 2 years later, on the occasion of the opening in New York, the American art historian Alfred Werner still stated that Americans simply couldn't believe that there could be any good German art after 12 years of devastating censorship and propaganda of the Nazi regime. Martin, Henson, and Huffman thus organized a show which was meant to counter all possible potential negative assessments of German art and culture before risking to show art which would not have been met with great admiration in the 1950s. As a result, presenting German 20th century art in the United States after the Second World War was by no means an equal, balanced presentation of all styles and forms of art, but rather a conscious decision for a moderated, heavily controlled form of organization and impact on what would build the canon of German modernism in this century. Before post-war art would be presented to the American audience, pre-war modernism had to be rehabilitated, and about 40% of the originally planned post-war artworks were cut out of the concept and layout. Only after this was achieved could a broader focus be set on more recent art. One exception was made, however, abstract art as an addendum to exhibitions such as the AFA's shows or the MoMA's show in '57. As a result, one could argue West German art of the 1950s never had a fair chance to establish itself internationally. Only in the late 1950s and early 1960s did official sponsoring for international exhibitions begin to fully engage contemporary art. But at that time, a number of active and influential artists of the late 1940s through the 1950s were already deceased. Except for very few names, such as the painter Ernst Wilhelm Ney or the sculptor Bernhard Heiliger, almost no artist of that time period made it into the 20th century canon, despite numerous efforts from both museum curators as well as art dealers in New York, for example, Martha Jackson. And even those, and I cut out my one paragraph now on how much the Americans proposed Bauhaus, I'm concluding. No, I do. I have 1 minute left. This paper dealt with the question of who shows, exhibits, and discusses art, and not who makes art. It is a pivotal question when we try to examine and explain how art is being canonized within art historical discourses. As I try to illustrate, post-war German modernism underwent a very unique and particular development, which I'm inclined to call, and I steal from Adorno, moderated movement, or moderated modernity. Curators such as Martin, Huffman, and Henson deliberately neglected post-war art in favor of pre-war modernism, thus artificially intervening into the development of artistic practice. This intervention even led to the fact that some artists would start painting or work in abstract styles in order to sell better. I argue that post-war art did not develop freely and wasn't received as much as it could have been, not only in the United States, would it not have been cut out. And this one example I presented here for the United States counts as well for about 10 further exhibitions I found, which exactly the same protagonists organized for Chile, Mexico, and a number of other states. So what I'm trying to point it out here is not a single case study. Thank you very much.
I will start my presentation with a short overview of the Italian scene of the aftermath of the Second World War, and then I briefly introduce the outfitting of 1954 Venice Biennale. In the end, I'm trying to close my presentation by focusing on two crucial paintings. I rather not talk about some sharp contrast. On the contrary, I will emphasize what seems to me more complex situation, very difficult to bring back to a clear essence. For geographical, historical, and political reasons, Italy was a key state for the Cold War balance. After 1945, Italy appeared as a divided country. On one side was the Christian Democrats Party, nourished by the double faith in the Church of Rome and the Marshall Economic Plan, under the umbrella of North Atlantic Treaty. On the opposite side, there were fiery communists devoted to another church, the Moscow one. The Italian Communist Party, PCI, was the biggest communist party outside the Soviet Union. Despite its defeat after the crucial election of 1948 and 1953, which confirmed the political majority and the subsequent government of Italy to the Christian Democratic Party, most part of Italian intellectuals, writers, artists, directors, were deeply attracted by the PCI. This fascination lasted for almost a decade. The Hungarian uprising in 1956 was the only event to give a crude disillusion to an entire generation of artists and intellectuals who believed in the joint possibility of democratic values, social engagement, and free expressions. Having a look at the political, social, and cultural situation, it seems that everything in those days was politicized and everything was polarized, even the most popular sport, just after soccer, of course, cycling. There were a Democrat champion, Gino Bartali, who did not hide his Catholic roots, and his rival, Fausto Coppi, who most of people suspected, with some reason, he had sympathies for the communism. In the aftermath of the war, the artistic creation also suffered from those conditions. Many artists followed the line promoted by Leonello Venturi. Already in 1946, while returning from his exile in USA, Venturi launched the movement concrete abstract art. This definition is very different from the concrete which we talked this morning. This definition refers to the many possibilities of abstract and formalist tendencies in order to align some prominent Italian painters to the modernist model promoted by the American institutions. Meanwhile, some left-wing artists, such as Afro Basaldella, here with Ville Florent, a Lucius painting of 1952, abandoned the realistic style and the vernacular subjects, thus gaining the possibility to present their works in the exhibition circuits promoted and discreetly supported by the Atlantic Organization in the United States and abroad. On the contrary, a group of young Roman artists called Form, had yet claimed in 1947 the need to remain at the same time formalists and Marxist. Therefore, they had the ambition to pursue a synthesis between formalism and communism orientation. Let's read the incipit of their declaration. Quote, "We declare ourselves formalist and Marxist by the conviction that the term Marxism and formalism are not discordant, especially now that the progressive elements of our society must maintain revolutionary and avant-gardist features." End of quote. Despite their efforts, those intentions remain unsatisfied. As an easily admitted proof, let's have a look at some of their works, such as this Petit Poème Socialiste, made by Piero D'Orazio, or Carla Accardi Scomposizione. With regards of this kind of painting, just in 1948, PCI Secretary Palmiro Togliatti wrote explicitly in terms of horrors and stupidity. And he then invited the progressing artist to a faithful alignment to the aesthetic dogmas of social realism, following the line established by one of the most important artists of that time, the Sicilian painter and communist militant Renato Guttuso. I think that this occupation of uncultivated land in Sicily, now in Berlin, is a striking example of that model of social realist promoted by PCI. This orientation was strengthened by the triumphant Picasso exhibition in 1953 in Italy. On that occasion, Picasso had the honor of the double retrospective in Rome and in Milan, and the enthusiastic claims of the radical newspapers. The political overtones of the entire operation were completely transparent. In Palazzo Reale in Milan, that was just restored after the Alien bombing of 1944, Guernica was displayed facing the more up-to-date painter massacre in Korea. Communist and socialist press emphasized the ideological meanings. Perhaps even Picasso was embarrassed by this explicitly political appropriation of his work, but of course he simply left things as they were. Like everyone else, he accepted the contradiction between modern style, realistic iconography, and the political assumptions. This situation culminated a year later. The 1954 International Exhibition in Venice was indeed characterized by the most striking opposition between formalist resolution and realist programs. In a certain way, we can look back at the National Pavilion mounted in Venice like a sort of artistic reformulation of some Cold War strategies. For the very first time since almost 50 years, the US Pavilion was directly organized by the Museum of Modern Art with the discreet support of the government agencies. The US Pavilion offered a double large exhibition, almost 30 works, devoted to Ben Shahn and Willem de Kooning, surrounded by 3 important sculptures of Gaston Lachaise, Ibrahim Lassave, and David Smith. Here and almost everywhere, in Great Britain Pavilion, for instance, with Ben Nicholson opposite to Lucien Freud and Francis Bacon, the balance between figuration and abstractions was very accurate. Shahn's works were presented as a model of a realism deeply connected with social issues, but his radical ideological values were purged. Conceived by for the most politicized European audience, the US Pavilion appears like a demonstration. In a liberal and open-minded country, the freedom of expression could guarantee even the persistence of a frank and straight realist language. Shahn was celebrated by Alfred Barr as, I quote, the champion of freedom with no compromise. But MoMA director also ensured that despite his radical conviction, Shahn gave official commissions, purchases for the museum, and he got the attention of the private collection too. For Shahn, as for any other realist painters, this was implicit in the message. There was no need to look outside in the direction of social realism or toward Soviet Union. But I think that Shahn participation is more understandable by having a look at the very bulky presence of that edition, the Gustave Courbet retrospective. Like Chane exhibition, Courbet retrospective was an official choice of the French government. But one might ask, what motivated the presence of a painter who died in 1877? What was Courbet's actuality? French organizers tried to present Courbet as a sober and strong realist, far away from any political engagement. Their selections were very accurate. The Commissar preferred neutral subject. The realistic trilogy of 1849 was not displayed. The Atelier and the Bourgeois et Ordonnance stay in Paris. The Stonebreaker was destroyed in Dresden in 1944. Most of the paintings have come from US museums. The organizer preferred to pay attention to the landscapes, to the still life paintings, and to the extraordinary figure of new paintings too, such as the source or the disconcerting woman with white stockings. So, this Cold War Courbet, in his Atlantic side, was a French realist, a great master, and a clue for any kind of naturalism, but nothing else. He was not, in any case, a political militant. This, at least, was his official image, as we can read in the catalog introduction, written with such an inviolable certainty by the Louvre curator Germain Bazin. Devant son temps comme pour les nôtres, Courbet risque d'être victime du même danger, celui d'être jugé par rapport à ses idées plutôt qu'en tant d'artiste. Honni par le bien-pensant de son époque à cause de ses convictions socialistes, Courbet est maintenant célébré par une partie de la critique comme le peintre révolutionnaire par excellence. Les communistes n'ont-ils pas été jusqu'à faire de lui le précurseur du réalisme socialiste? En fait, il est curieux de voir attribuer tant d'importance aux idées d'un homme dont l'art participe si peu de la pensée. On the contrary, some left-wing commentators drew the image of a progressive challenger who fought against the bourgeoisie, making him a working-class hero. Yet in 1952, Louise Aragon wrote, I quote, l'apparition du phénomène Courbet dans la peinture coïncide avec l'éveil du géant ouvrier dans son siècle. Both socialist and communist press share this position, despite the absence of the most radical paintings. Some progressive commentators assume as a key picture of the retrospective Courbet's self-portrait depicted in jail after the Paris Commune. In their eyes, the communal Courbet should become the model for any artist involved in the contemporary social struggle. This, in sum, was his legacy, and it was spread across the decades and over the centuries. This should not surprise us. In fact, many examples of such arguments were on the agenda of those same days, and similar disputes involved authors even more far away than Courbet, as this was the case of Caravaggio. Caravaggio was the protagonist of the crucial exhibition curated in 1951 by the eminent Italian art historian Roberto Longhi. In this exhibition, entitled The Painter of Reality, Longhi considered Caravaggio to be the founder of modern realism. Caravaggio was the starting point of a revolutionary path that culminated in great French masters, such as Courbet, of course, Picasso, and some others, just like Ben Shahn. A revolution, that of realism, is worth to say, which regards exclusively the pictorial practices. Courbet retrospective became the foreground for a complex system of juxtapositions. Inside this strong polarization, every artistic statement could immediately become a political position, or could be read as such. Let me give an example. The natural counterpart of Courbet's presence in Venice Biennale was, in the general opinion, the exhibition devoted to three major surrealistic painters, such as Max Ernst, Joan Miró, and Jean Arp. Most of the liberal commentators appreciated their works as a sign of continuity with the best avant-garde position. Their paintings, however, were suddenly criticized in the Italian by the communist press as a kind of formalistic deviation of a decaying style. Nevertheless, even in Italy, inside the opposite position of formalist and realist, liberals against Marxists, some form of resistance, ironic subversions, or simply a negotiation of that hegemonic but rigid paradigm were produced even in 1954. And for this reason, I will close by focusing on two crucial paintings from the same Venice Biennale. The first painting is Renato Guttuso's Boogie Woogie, which seems a satire of Mondrian masterwork by placing it in the foreground of a contemporary dance scene. We are in a crowded basement full of young people dressing in a formal way. They freely dance on a music that is supposed to come from Glenn Miller Orchestra. The same tunes that 10 years before accompanied the triumphal entry of American soldiers in Rome. Guttuso's aim was not sarcastic. He did not have any intention to mock Mondrian painting at all. Instead, he had always declared his admiration for the Dutch master. Nor did he detest, as far as I know, American popular song. On the contrary, Guttuso wanted to criticize his young fellows, those who declared, just some years before, the will to bypass realistic paintings, to be a modern, abstract, formalist painter, and to endure to consider himself as Marxist. In a word, the aim of this painting is to satirize the clearly recognizable members of the former group. Here they are. And in this collective portrait, Guttuso depicts the subscriber of that naive declaration. All of them are dressed with a striped shirt, the exact one supplied by US Army. These shirts are the same as those that we can see in some characters wearing some neorealistic movie, and in their billboard too. There were visible signs of youth, of course, but they even could be considered a sign of some artificial or deceptive acceptance of a foreign model. This remarkable painting is not a declaration against abstraction, nor a position against Mondrian. It is an act of deference to the great master and, at the same time, an act of warning. It looks like an advice. Guttuso seems to say, beware of the mimetic or superficial imitation. Art, and most of all abstract art, is difficult. It's not like dancing following Glenn Miller tunes. Painting and abstract painting, above all, is rooted in a specific tradition. And I can tell you this, Guttuso might think, by declaring on the canvas my own abilities to paint as a sincerely social realist and, at the same time, by depicting, ironically, my potential skill as an abstract painter too. If only I wanted, if only I were not a faithful Orthodox Marxist and therefore a convincing realist, not a formalist Marxist. The second painting, and I close, is Willem de Kooning Excavations. Everyone appreciates this great canvas as one of the most gorgeous paintings of that time. It's a stunning abstract composition made by a dense brushwork with sliding planes and open contours. The line defines some part, human noses, eyes, teeth, necks, and jaws, revealing a tension between abstraction and figuration. Although de Kooning made totally different formal choices, we may contemplate the same tension that was inactive in Guttuz's work. It participates of the same irony that this masterpiece of abstraction and supposedly disengaged formalism has its roots in a masterpiece of the most ideological oriented realism. In fact, it refers, as de Kooning himself declared, to Giuseppe De Santis' neorealistic movie Riso amaro. The woman, the hard job, the water, the heroism. But, to the best of my knowledge, no one says something about this in 1954. No one got what the painters were really saying. Critics prefer to stay inside the most predictable polarity, formalism versus realism, democracy versus communism, and so on. And let me finally conclude with something very simple and maybe a little bit sad about this interchange and about the ideological boundaries in which they occur. No matter their difference of orientation driven by their very ideological prejudice, most of the commentators of 1954 Venice Biennale saw in Courbet paintings what was not there. And from the same reason, the same commentators failed to see what really was in Guttuz and de Kooning's paintings. At the time of cultural Cold War, this was really a shame. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the directors and the organizers to have permitted to me to be here. They don't know what they risk. And also I would like to thank you all for the special atmosphere of this symposium, for your presence and the collateral meetings we all have had after each panel. And I would like to begin with the... let's look at the title. Optical, kinetic, and program. They are all labels, all labels. And as you know, artists always rejected labels. So it does not matter to discuss if it's better to speak about optical or kinetic or so on. I will use, and it will be clear during my contribution, a comprehensive couple of terms that is kinetic and programmed. Even if in the United States they prefer op or optical, and probably programmed or arte programmata is most known and used in Italy. However, I would like to open this contribution to some suggestion I received from Augulu and Dr. Atreyu Gupta yesterday that call for kind of analysis that don't try to find new words, but try to make words more precise and more linked to contingency. So I will use another quotation, this time from Al-Salahi, and the quotation is, get down to work. Probably you are thinking that the Italians always polarize everything, Coppi, Bartali, PCI, and democratic Christians. But we can, in these images, to have a very precise representation of two kinds of industrial model and two kinds of model of and conception of labor. On the left, we have Fiat, you know, Fiat Automobile, the most important Italian industry, car industry. The most important American, not most important American, but, and we will discover how, where is the root of that in a few minutes. And it's perfectly Fordist. It's a line, assembly line. We can see the two workers. They don't look at the camera. They are working. So in the assembly line, time is the master. And of course, there are low-skilled workers, and they work on the cars to live. On the other side, we can show a very significant images of Adriano Olivetti's jewel. Probably you know Italy for fashion and shoes or food, but in 1959, Adriano Olivetti, the Olivetti company, began its history at the end of the 19th century with typewriters, then desk calculator, and then with electronics. In 1959, the electronic division of Olivetti realized the first mainframe computer completely based on transistor worldwide. In 1959, Italy electronic industry was more advanced than IBM, even if IBM can invest on this sector 20, 50, 100 more capitals. And look at the two pictures. So in the second, we have a very specialized engineers that look at the camera. So I don't want to compare, of course, a low-skilled worker, very poor, and a highly specialized and well-paid engineer. I simply want to compare some condition of work. First, the line, time-based. The master is time. You have to make the same gesture all the time, you know. Second, the working island. It's a real different condition of working. Some persons working on an object, and they are, as a group, as a team, the responsibility of the quality of the project. Responsibility is the master, not time. During the working day, Olivetti, not simply the engineers, also the lowest level worker, can go to the library, the internal library, for example, to read a newspaper or a magazine, to update them about working models and so on, because they were responsible of the work they are doing in their island. In 1964 happened something really disastrous. Olivetti company was forced to sell to the American company General Electric, well known, his electronic division, his jewel. And it was forced to do that by them. How it happens? Olivetti was in 1963, 1964 healthy from an industrial point of view, but it was passing a period of liquidity crisis, a financial crisis. Also because the electronic division is a sector that needs very high investments and cannot produce economic profit in the Italy and Europe of the middle 60s, because these jewels, like the French ball in the same time, they were very advanced industry in a desert, while American system was crowded of very powerful industrial realities. So, for the financial crisis, Olivetti was forced to open up his capital to other investors. And it was saved by a group of intervention led by Fiat. The condition to be saved was the selling of the electronic division. Vittorio Valletta, the chairman of Fiat, said, yes, Olivetti is healthy, but we have the electronic division. It's a thorn in the side to be removed. And they removed. And they removed by selling it to General Electric. But Fiat and General Electric were friends. They were allied companies with many joint ventures in America. So, for some commentators, this selling was considered a real exchange of favors between friends, between allied companies. In this sense, we can say that the friendship between Fiat and America is history of nowadays. You know, now we have Fiat Chrysler company. We have no more Italian industry. So it was a real disaster for Italian industry of international technology. A real disaster. Also for European, because in the same time, General Electric bought the French Bull, also very advanced from a technological point of view. But, of course, it was a very good affair for Fiat, because he made the relation with General Electric stronger, but also he gained an advantage on the national level and political level, because he could make his model of industry and labor victorious. All main political history of Italy after that was really influenced by this victory, because the influence of such a larger industry on the political class was very strong. Nobody moved a finger. Even the PCI, the strongest communist party of the West, moved a finger to save that reality. Why? That reality, it means not simply 300 engineers, but it means development in a sector that other countries, more far-sighted, already judge strategic. And nor the PCI move a fingers, because they were interested in labor, such kind of labor. We saw in the keynote by Boris Groys, this is the hero of, not that, this is very specialized, very responsible, something different. While this thing was happening, Olivetti was the most important sponsor of the kinetic and programmed avant-garde. It was very well known. The first exhibition, Arte Programmata, was opened at the Olivetti shop in Milan in 1962. It was a very important show, even if it showed not so many artists and exclusively only Italian artists, Gruppo N, Gruppo T, Enzo Mari, Getulio Alviani, and Bruno Munari. However, it was so important because for this show they coined a term, and they produced a theory that would be spread also out of Italy and in USA. After the opening in Milan, they have also other shows in the Olivetti shops in Venice during the Biennale, then in Rome, then in Trieste, then in Düsseldorf, always in the Olivetti shops, and in London. And from 1964, the show began a tour in the United States, starting from the Loeb Student Center in New York. There was a strong relationship between what Olivetti meant as an industry for what he produced, but also for the model of labor carried on by, Adriano was died, but carried on by his son Roberto. Because in the Olivetti conception, work was both the way for a responsible and personal growth, and the quality intended as quality of a process to be transferred in the object. So Arte Programmata was a perfect slogan, a perfect propaganda for these two concepts. And even if it was rejected by some artists, each artist intended the term in a different way. We can discuss about it, but what I want to highlight here that not only the object perfectly represent this kind of object produced by Olivetti, but the artists themselves present themselves as technicians. This is a photograph of Gruppo N. Look at them. They are working with something that seems very specialized engineers. And also in their declaration, they highlight the key point of work or labor. I'm using work and labor, sometimes work, sometimes labor. I will touch this point later. For example, Gianni Colombo from Gruppo T, one of the participants of Arte Programmata show, predicted a progress from a passive viewing to an active comprehension of the object and its internal mechanical structure. He would like to inaugurate a new kind of spectator that is not simply a passive viewer, but a technician itself. Gruppo N, Gruppo T ed Enzo Mari, all together as quite a super group, declared in 1963 at the Congress of Rimini, the Congress of Rimini, it is crucial that what we attempt to accomplish be valued as a labor, grounded on a certain structural methodology. By framing the definition of an art object and of the plastic space in terms of labor, they tried, I'm reassuming what they declared, to grant the possibility to free the object from the art market, from its logic, to free the object from the exhibition context. In other words, to allow the object to avoid being exploited or manipulated for communication purposes. So, it's another way to see programmed and kinetic art. Of course, there are always some common features. Some common feature to (1965). Another couple of images. MoMA, Nova Tendencia. Another difference, the middle-class woman for the press release of MoMA, and Nova Tendencia official image, the meeting of all the participants. It's very political. While, of course, in Responsive Eye, the Responsive Eye was focused on perceptive abstraction, on optical effect, and so on, and it avoided ideological and political matters. American critics and artists didn't like op art. Barbara Rose states, the European works made one think that optical art was chosen as a context in order to satisfy the museum's commitment. It would be interesting to speak about MoMA commitments in those years. And that the European art seemed like a showcase for the American works, which by contrast shone like so many diamonds in a field of synthetic brilliance. So, Sidney Tillings, in another article in Art magazine, distinguished two types of op art. American type, colored-oriented and art edge, and European type, in which he can perceive a strange and foreign system of plane, and foreign to what? And now I try to reassume all the questions relating to optical effect, kineticism, and labor in a consideration about the plastic space. This is the well-known model for constructivism, or by now Gabo. You know, he said that the new art will track the passages from the volumetric form to a stereometric one with transparency and so on. But the model for the kinetic relief is another one. This is my drawing. I'm very satisfied by it. I made it with the paint, Windows Paint. And the base model for the kinetic programmed relief is a system of parallel plane, as we can see in some examples. It's a base structure. I don't want to say that all the kinetic reliefs are squared and cubic and so on. But however, the structure, it returns in many examples, as I can show to you. There's very well-known works. Even if the space between the first plane and the second plane is narrower and the optical effect is more effective, the structure is the same, parallel planes. So, what happens at the responsive eye? Panic. Look at the blonde woman. Tack. She's looking at Ivaral reliefs. Tack. Tack. Again. So, the system of parallel planes works like a machine, and the viewer can, moving around it, can exactly activate and deactivate it, on, off. It's a binary system. Tack. Activation, disactivation. This is a Brian De Palma documentary on responsive eye, very beautiful. Please, it's on YouTube, you can download it, it's very beautiful, very beautiful. And so, what I'm trying to demonstrate, I don't know. That one of the key concepts of the kinetic and programmed relief is the possibility to activate and deactivate it. This is my drawing. Now you can recall the style. I think it's quite clear, so I can go forward. In this sense, there is a strong familiarity between simple reliefs make of planes and more complex structure that need button electronics and other devices. There is a whole group. In my opinion, the parallel planes system is an evolution or probably a development of the constructivism plastic space. I'm concluding, I'm not saying that they were the first to use parallel planes. I simply say they use a lot as a basic model, even in an unconscious, I don't know, way. And this was an attempt to renew the plastic space, including innate movement and laborious movement, through the activation and activation movements, so through program, and to include such a political suggestion together with a certain conception of labor without detaching such movement from the surface of the object. So what we are speaking about is a plastic space that do not abandon the object as a point of reference. I would like to Mosquera's also speak about something about that. So in my opinion, the short season of kinetic and programmed avant-garde was very important because it is the end, the last attempt to include politics in the object without dissolving it. The plastic space, if we can call it plastic space again, from a Western point of view that came afterwards, arte povera, conceptualism, and so on, are something really different. I finished.
Okay, first of all, I think it's, first of all, I want to say, don't start the clock yet. I'm just going to say thank you, and so don't start the clock. No, because it's, I have to be careful about that. My talk might be a little longer, 5 minutes, but I'm going to speak very fast, so I'm going to try to have my conclusion, because my conclusion is a little bit cookie, but I think it's a fun one, so I'm going to try to do that. First, then, I want to say, of course, that like everybody else, I'm pretty happy to be here, but I'm a little bit also sad about it, because you people are all so young. And it's wonderful to see all new voices and new things. And young Okwi will be able to, with your help, to change the world. I mean, so that's very good. So I'm very impressed by that, but depressed at the same time, because, yeah, so. So now you can start now. So my title, of course, and I know you're going to be. I can see in your eyes. You're going to already be upset because I'm going to talk about centers. Paris, New York. So, I mean, it's pretty embarrassing to be here and to say, I want to try to deconstruct a little bit the complexity of the battles between those two cities, because I think it's still interesting, and I think we have a lot of things to say about this. And also I want to mention that I am working on an exhibition about foreign artists in Paris during the 50s and 60s, so this is, for me, was very helpful. So, Colors of Failed Utopia, or Postwar Paris, New York, Dream of Universalism. During the occupation, French public and artists alike discovered the importance of dialogue through art in order to protect an endangered national identity. Paintings, poetry, tapestry, films, novels became a way to keep up hope for a brilliant future based on a still living and protected past. The role of art as an important identity public discourse was a constant undercurrent not only during the war, but also during the period of reconstruction. This is important for France, and during the Cold War. However, the traditional sense of belonging to a specific and coherent culture was more and more threatened as years went by. So I'm going to show you that this is the period I'm talking about. I'm talking about a period between those pictures by Douaneau about the fact that there's nothing to sell in France. It says nothing, y a rien à vendre, nothing to, tout est factice, everything is fake, right? And the other one, Gilbert Bécaud, the famous singer, who is jumping on his new Vespa and is going through paradise, in a sense, of consumerism, right? So it's in between those two things. So I want to mention, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in 1944. And for example, Claude Lévi-Strauss, working for the French government in New York, established the post-war issue eloquently as soon as the war was over. I quote him, "Of the three forces on which French prestige used to be based, at least two, military force and economic force, are destined, I expect, for many years to play a secondary role. Only the force of our culture and the prestige of our civilization are still intact. They constitute the supreme resource on which we can, almost exclusively rely to justify, in the future, the confidence that the popular masses and the cultural opinion of the entire world have totally put in us in such a moving way." End of quote. At a time when many art writers were referring to a new internationalism in art, the first issue of May-April 1946 of the magazine Les Études Américaines appeared in France with an article by Walter Lippmann called La Destinée Américaine, which was overtly patriotic. I wanted to compare that with Lévi-Strauss. The new quote-unquote internationalism called for by many seemed to be actually, according to him, Americanism. Quote, "Fate has willed it that America is from now on to be at the center of Western civilization rather than on periphery. The American idea is based on a certain image of man and his place in the universe. This tradition has come down to Americans and to all citizens of the West from the Mediterranean world of the ancient Greeks, Jews, and Romans. The Atlantic is now the Mediterranean of this culture and faith. This is no accident. The prospect before us is grand. The schism between East and West that began in the Middle Ages between the 5th and 11th century of our era is about to come to an end." End of quote. So a cultural shift that, of course, been witnessed by many people, like Fernand Léger, for example, who, coming back to Paris from his exile to New York, explained already in April 13, 1946, in Les Lettres Françaises, that he witnessed with pleasure a new cultural life in the US. Quote, "Does American painting exist? Yes, and it is developing rapidly. Young painters are throwing themselves into their work with such intensity that it is impossible that a nation which has given itself the best professors and the finest art collections in the world will not one day achieve an original style of its own. I am convinced that the Americans are on the way toward a period of greatness in art. The first signs are already here." End of quote. On April 24th, 1947, though, just to show the battle that is going on even in each country, that's what I think is interesting. There's nothing one voice. Georges Valdemar, a right-wing writer for Le Figaro in Paris, was on the contrary calling on French art to recover its original virtues in order to keep its traditional image. Quote, "If the world wants erector sets, monsters, or colossi, it does not need us. The mission of French art is to defend the individual rights of man, his dignity, his charm, and his value against the enemy forces. The made in USA spirit and the herd spirit of the Slavic East. French art can carry out this mission only if it returns to concrete realities and recovers its original virtues, a love of things and well-crafted work, a spirit of observation and a critical spirit." End of quote. By the way, he was not very critical himself, but that's another story. So the battle for universalism was on. In France, on the one of the first attempts at revamping the image of the country after the war was a publication in English, which is interesting, of a luxurious magazine called Paris Lives, with color photographs and description of French post-war revival. This reconstruction, the manipulation by the French of their brilliant and luxurious aristocratic past, had ambiguous results because this was a recycling of same old cliches of high-class French glamour defining the country, pronounced at a time when people were in the process of discovering a crashed economy, ruined city, and bruised souls. This old idea was trying to convey to the rest of the world that, despite the horrendous loss of real political and economic power, nothing had really changed in the symbolical world. Paris was still Paris, as they used to say. But by the same token, though, they were also saying for people who could read between the lines that nothing had changed, all right, that the country was still stuck in our old 18th and 19th century image, while the world elsewhere was moving at a furious pace. The role of the magazine was nevertheless to convince the Anglo-Saxon world that France was back. As Léon Paul Farge said in this introduction, war and battles were not that important. What really mattered was that despite all of this, France continued to work, to invent, to produce art. I'm quoting now Paul Farge. I'm sorry, it sounds terrible, because you'll see, I mean, it's a little bit out there. That is why there is a certain pride in reminding oneself and in reminding others that France endured the occupation and that she continued to create and to enrich the world, although it knew it not, for she disposed of means stronger than weapons, such as her taste, perspicacity, professional consciousness, her application, and lastly, her legendary love of beautiful furnitures, of gardens, of fine books, of poetry, of painting, decoration and fashion, of street and facades, as will be seen in his album composed in honor of her competence in these matters and her contribution to the life of men and things. End of quote. Wow. Ironically, though, this display of luxury goods, including architecture, books, art, and fashionable women's hat, does not seem to have been a very judicious move, because the image sold abroad was one displaying the haute bourgeoisie aristocratic lifestyle of a religious, academic, classical environment, and in particular of a colonial France. All things which were going against the new image developed after the war by Western democracies, and in particular by the US. But what was also very clear, and in that the editors were right, was that reconstruction could not only be based on mortar and wood, but needed also to be located in the imaginary. The US, on the other hand, necessitated to create a new image far from the traditional cliché of technology, force, film, and populist superficiality. So that's what we see the battle. For the French government, art and fashion were sites where the redrawing of a national image could be done very convincingly. That is why the Theater of Fashion or Haute Couture exhibition, presented with miniature doll-sized model due to rationing, enjoyed a considerable success in the United States in 1945 and 46. The image of France as fashion was an unquestionable hit. So I'm showing you here that the type of images that they were sending to the US on the west and the east coast, and Schiaparelli, for example, very famous designer, were actually producing those little clothes and stuff like that on small doll, and down I'm showing you those dolls were also wearing very miniature leather shoes and stuff like that. So it was really very well done, and the decors were produced by Cocteau and some famous decor artists. So this is the size that you see. That was quite big, and this is the one that Cocteau did, the destruction of Paris and the bombing of Paris, while you have all those beautiful women dressed in gowns, kind of walking around. So this was a hit, but the French sent also another exhibition to influence the Americans, and the French art survey called Painting in France 1939-1945, through which France was trying to reclaim their pre-war hegemony, on the contrary, failed miserably, due in large part to ineptitude of the administration, which did not understand that the traditional look of the artistic school of Paris, so-called, was unable to embody the ambient anxiety and despair engulfing the post-war world. The idea of supporting artists mixing Matisse color and Picasso structure became, despite new hopes, the proverbial kiss of death. The French thought that if you mix those two heroes, you're gonna create a third one. The show was gleefully reviled by American critics on account of its old-fashioned character. Paris was becoming artificial and somewhat effeminate, whereas New York was appropriating for itself the most up-to-date intellectual and virile forms of artistic production. These international presentations were not only a French idea, because a show called Advancing American Art was sent to Europe and Latin America by the Americans in order to advertise American modern art production. This show, despite an interesting attempt at showing the latest US production to the world, became the target of attacks so violent in the US Congress that the planned European tour had to be cancelled while in Prague and immediately repatriated. These two exhibitions that I'm just talking about, Advancing American Art, one in Europe and one in Latin America, was prepared by Leroy Davidson, and those two exhibitions were very ambitious, as they were trying to propose to the rest of the world an image of America far from the traditional cliché of the country as wild, unsophisticated, and culturally old-fashioned. The State Department, understanding the urgency for the need to derail the aggressive but smooth cultural offensive driven by the USSR in Europe, launched a kind of two-part rocket towards Europe and Latin America, two places where left forces were gaining ground. For the first time, Davidson was showing abroad not the past of American art, but what was the most active and experimental in the land. Generally, the New York art critics were happy about this, to see that this attempt to show internationally works on modern culture, as they thought that the Americans, compared to the European and French in particular, had nothing to be ashamed of when talking about contemporary culture. The critic Alfred Frankfurter, reviewing the show, remarked with humor that, quote, "This time, we are exporting neither domestic brandy in imitation cognac bottles, nor vintage non-intoxicating grape juice, but real bourbon, aged in the wood, what may just be described as the wine of the country," end of quote. This ethylic metaphor put in evidence a certain dose of pleasure and seemed that for some, the bottle was in accord with a new national ecstasy. This exhibition, placed under the Office of International Propaganda and Cultural Affairs, was part of a larger political program. Everything was prepared meticulously, I didn't see it again, so that the purchase made by the government with public money represented as accurately as possible the cultural vitality of the country. So that's the French style, and this is the American. We're standing around abstraction, this. The selection was particularly judicious as, along with well-known artists, African Americans like Robert Guatme and Romery Burden were included. Ben Chan and Stuart Davis, usually part of the list, were near more traditional artists like Max Weber and Georgia O'Keeffe. The scene was apparently well covered. But in the end, this extraordinary compilation became caught in an ideological storm, which will, in the end, cause the experiment to collapse due to a rapid change of national and international climate. Indeed, as the Iron Curtain was lowered by Churchill in March 1946, conservatives in Congress forced the immediate repatriation of all those pictures, which, according to their understanding, did not represent the force, the beauty, and the importance of the American civilization. Cultural isolationism still had a strong pull in American society, and so the show was interrupted in April 47. 117 works were sent back to Washington, where they were auctioned at 95% discount. I know, I just didn't buy one. So. Between, did you show me something that's, oh, I'm terrible, it's going to be in problem. Between 1946 and 47, then, the battle for cultural supremacy moved towards Brazil. In November 1946, Nelson Rockefeller was busy preparing an important trip to Brazil in order to extol the values of the American way of life and culture. 2 days before leaving for Brazil, as a kind of afterthought, he had an idea which would have important consequences. Rockefeller asked his secretary and Dorothy Miller of the MoMA to indulge in a painting buying spree around modern galleries in New York, so to arrive in Brazil with the latest modern production from the American capital. And also because he heard that the French were involved also. I'm going to talk about this. But I'm going to cut because, okay. Sure? No, I don't want, okay. So the plan was to donate these collected pictures by young artists in their 30s. Calder was the oldest one at 48. To the country, to the Brazil, as gifts, or rather as an enticement, through example, for Brazilian collectors to follow and to initiate a drive to buy modern and contemporary art, while by the same token buying the anti-modernist ideology of progress. That was important, youth and freedom. 10 pictures were taken by plane to Brazil by Rockefeller himself. They were, it was emphasized, all, including those made by Europeans, made in the US, so as to emphasize the creative power of the American soil. Okay, so he does this because, as I said, he's going to also try to send a show by Alfred Barr called What is Modern Painting, that we know about, designed to advertise modern art. What the defense of modern art, even the most radical, meant in global terms was, in Rockefeller's mind, the liberation of the progressive spirit, right? Not that. Seen from New York, but also present in France, Italy, and Brazil, where Western culture was struggling against a wide appeal of communism among working classes, and they had two paths to choose from. Modern art, signifying the embattled individual, thrusting forwards towards liberation in a fluid and open society, and realistic art, we talked about that, which represented predetermined aesthetic patterns and propagandistic message in support of a monolithic and closed socialist society. So that was the issue. I'm just showing you here some of the images that are presented about French art in America in those days. It's always or effeminate or you are too old. So Matisse is a good thing. He's always in bed. He cannot activity. He had to use to cut the color papers just like if he was. I hate to say this, but if he was a woman in bed, I mean, he cannot. He's like a textile kind of a guy. So all the representation of the French is always like this, Charles Etienne is asleep, Vols is a kind of taking care of his afternoon, he plays the banjo, Matisse is old, over there Mathieu, who is he's the equivalent of Jackson Pollock, is always represented like an odalisque, I mean, come on. And of course, the last on the right side is that the French are, all they talk about is about sex, and that's why you have the couple in front of the very big, gigantic symbol. Okay, so or this cartoons about a French office, 19th century, right? Over there, an old woman taking care of old books that from the 19th century, and if you look carefully, there is all kinds of spiders coming down and so on and so forth. So the country is completely dead, and this is what Pollock, the way they represent Pollock, of course, which is interesting. So those are kind of the activities that is going on in Paris or in Europe at the time. A lot of magazines are being produced by and translated in French to explain the quality of American culture. I wanted to go though, I know I don't have time, so I wanted to show you this though, because this is interesting. There is a crisis in America. They don't really know how to say what kind of culture do they want. But basically, they don't want to talk about class struggle. Of course, this is kind of something that only the communists and Russia would talk. But we have this differentiation. They realize that if you are interested, if you are kind of an intellectual, and if you are kind of fairly rich, you are interested in Picasso, right? In modernism. If you are kind of a middle class on the right side over there, no, you like some kind of a traditional American countryside picture. And if you are really out to lunch, you cannot even put your shirt in your pants, and you are interested in posters with naked girls, right? So that's what they talk about. And also they define, even in a more, that I cannot have time to do this, but you have, that's the time when they describe the society with the eggheads. Like you have eggheads, you are an intellectual. So the intellectuals, they explain how, so low brow, middle brow, and so, But if your eggs, you like dancing, you like to drink red wine, you like abstraction, you have modern design, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I don't want to, you know this. So now I wanted to show you what's going on in France, though, at the same time, because when the Americans are trying to establish a certain type of environment, in a sense, and an ideology, the French are doing the same thing. So if I may have 5 minutes. No, she just said 5 minutes. So, Michel Tapier de Céléran and Charles Etienne, representing the new wave of abstraction in Paris, became the center of attention in the early 50s. What was at stake at the time, and Charles Etienne especially understood this, was the need for the creation of a new modern French identity, an identity rooted, he thought, in a long past, but armed with contemporary clout. What we needed, but not really found, was a present open to a universal future, right? Obviously developed from a French base, like it used to. Yes, he says, the Americans were dripping. Estienne knew this, and Pollock was mildly interesting to him. But what fascinated him more was the fact that the French were staining. They were staining. The French were doing tâche, right? This is his article about the tâchisme. Le tâchisme, which according to him had been invented around 1952 by painters he was supporting, was also, like the New York version, an art about freedom of expression. But in Paris, he explained, expression always starts from scratch, from the unarticulated, the dirt, the stain, like the placenta, as he actually said. This art, Estienne mentioned, using the fashionable phrase of Roland Barthes, who has just published his famous book, Écriture degré zéro, is a total reenactment. Quote, the tâche is a degree zero of plastic writing, he says, end of quote. And now that stems from the individual rather from a style, as Clement Greenberg was imposing. Le tâchisme was a French parallel version of abstract expressionism, but a type of painting created in France in order to counteract the publicity that people like Michel Tapier was giving to the Americans by inviting Pollock to be, as he said naively in his catalogue of Pollock's work present in Paris in '52, Pollock with us. A clear but naive attempt to include Pollock into his vision of a new Parisian universalism at the time when the people in Paris were writing on the floor, US go home. So he wanted to include it, America, in his overlooking kind of powerful school. What we have here in the end is a very clear battle between two lifestyles located in the high spheres of culture, the French versus the American. This art autre, as Tapier was talking about, orchestrated by Michel Tapier, who organized a modern stable of international artists from around the world, French, Japanese, American, German artists, tried innocently to integrate American artists in his worldwide avant-garde construction. With the abstract artist Georges Mathieu, he published the magazine The United States Line Paris Review for a luxury transatlantic liner, where they were talking about, quote, the vitality and grandeur of our Western civilization on both sides of the Atlantic, end of quote. For Mathieu, the past, what he called classicism, was over, and a new world was opening up based on the sharp consciousness of the present. In clear opposition, Charles Etienne, the other art critic, was digging with the help of André Breton, who had finally accepted abstraction, deep into the French past in order to find a connection between, as surprising as it may sound, the art of the Celts and tâchisme. Compared to the Greek-Roman classical empire, read American, the Celts were subversive in their abstract deconstructive way discovered in the formal history of coins. They had a huge exhibition of coins, of Celts coins, and so Breton and Charles Etienne say, that's it, we are Celts, so we are abstract, more abstract than the Romans, so abstraction was invented in France, right? This battle seems silly until one realizes that what was at stake there was the way one saw the position of France in the larger political struggle between France and the US at a time when several key problems were posed, like the reactivation of the Cold War after the death of Stalin, when major conflicts opposed the Atlantists to the neutralists in France, and so on. Yeah. it seems that Charles Etienne and André Breton were actually trying to carve out an independent space far away from America, a French space where the critics from Brittany, Charles Etienne, so here is Charles Etienne is on the right side over there. He's like in Brittany, he's like a sailor. He has a little sailboat, and also an art critic, and that's Mathieu, who is kind of dealing with this huge stuff. So the liner. So the opposition cannot be bigger than this. So Charles Etienne and Breton were actually trying to carve out an independent space far away from America, a French space where the critic from Brittany, Charles Etienne, vaunted the tradition of the small sailor's boat against the transatlantic liner supported by aristocratic Tapier and Mathieu, who seemed to have sold their soul to the most powerful interest of the moment, America. This was a losing battle, of course, and Etienne abandoned what he felt was a corrupt art world for the coast of Brittany, where he, between trips in his small boat, wrote popular songs for the anarchist singer Léo Ferré. André Breton and Charles Etienne, in their stubborn utopian independence, looked a lot like those heroes, Asterix and Obelix, who refused to buckle down under the powerful mechanization of the empire, knowing full well that victory was out of the question, but that self-preservation, cultural difference against all odds had to be protected. And I'm going to miss my conclusion because I don't have time. So that's it. Thank you.